Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the second session of USINDO's 2024 presidential election series in Washington. Our guest speaker today, nicely in the middle, is Tom Lembong, representing Pak Anies Baswedan's coalition, running for president and vice president of Indonesia. USINDO co-chair USINDO welcomes all of you today to our special open forum luncheon. These three events in 2024, which is our third such series, we had one in 2014, 2019, are structured to inform us authoritatively about Indonesia's fast approaching February 14th presidential election and the key issues in play by hearing directly and live from senior representatives of the contending coalitions designated by their coalitions to attend USINDO's series. It's based on our successful previous programs and USINDO's recognized neutral role. People come up to me all the time and say, okay, I understand you have to be neutral, but who is USINDO really supporting? And I always say, as I said, USINDO is neutral. And that's what I'm always going to continue to say. Because if we're not neutral, it's impossible for us to do this. But we are interested in providing each of the three competing coalitions an equal and balanced format to give our audience a window into each of their visions for Indonesia's future. And I might add, not only their own visions, but Pak Tom, I don't mind if you say why your coalition is great and what you see as the areas for improvement in other coalitions, or share as much of your strategy. We don't mind that as long as USINDO is not saying that. You can say whatever you like. So we're honored that all three coalitions who are fielding candidates for president and vice president have appointed a senior spokesperson to present their views at our series. They see this as an opportunity to get their views across to the American audience. That's pretty important because it's not just that we want to hear about them, but they want to make sure that we hear about them. And, they have their own foreign policy. They have their issues with China. They want to diversify and make sure that their friends in the United States understand their position also. So it's an opportunity for them, if I may say, as well as a big opportunity for us. So we're glad they want to do that. So for us, it's a unique opportunity to become directly and authoritative informed from them, not from USINDO. Although, we do that as well. Now, this election whose outcome will affect the trajectory of this rapidly rising, but still insufficiently understood nation. Only USINDO is in a position to produce this kind of equally balanced series in this political space. Today, we're honored to have as our speaker, as I said, Tom Lembong, senior advisor of the team of former Jakarta Governor Anies Baswedan and Mohammed Iskandar. Bob Blake will say more about him, but Tom is U.S. educated at Harvard and has held very key economic positions in the government of Indonesia.
Well, thank you very much, David. And let me add my own warm words of welcome to everybody today. It's great to see a big crowd. And of course, a particularly warm welcome to our old friend, Tom Lembong. Tom, you see a large crowd here, I think, because Indonesia really matters to the United States. And it matters in two ways. I mean, we've talked in the past about how this is the year of elections around the world. Half of the world is going to be going to elections in places like India and Indonesia and the United States and elsewhere. And there's growing concern about democracy around the world and the conduct of elections. And so how Indonesia conducts itself really matters. And I think we all have great confidence that your country is, acquit itself very, very well as it has in the past. So that's the first thing. And I think the other thing, of course, is that Indonesia, of course, matters to the United States strategically and economically and politically. All of you know that our two presidents signed a new strategic comprehensive partnership this fall, which is the highest level of partnership that we have in the United States. And I think that really reflects not only the growing interest that we have in Indonesia, but also the great optimism we have about Indonesia's future and how it's going to become an even more important partner for us over the next 30 or 40 years. And so it's in that context that we really welcome you here to Tom. And for all of you who don't know Tom, as David said, he was first educated at Harvard. We won't hold that against him. From there, he went off to go into the private equity business for a while. He was at Morgan Stanley and then at Deutsche Bank. And then he did a whole series of jobs in government, which is where I first got to know Tom. He was one of the most outspoken ministers on behalf of economic reform and encouraging the role of the private sector. And so, and he was a little bit of a lone voice when he first started. So it was always a pleasure to talk to him. And sometimes he would get criticized from his own fellow ministers, about being a little bit too outspoken in calling for the reforms that really were needed. And so he's been a great champion for the American private sector and for business overall. First as Minister of Investment, head of what they call BKPM, but then also as Minister of Trade. So again, just a tremendous amount of experience that he brings to this very, very important job as special advisor to Anis. You all know Anis very well as well. He's another person who's been educated in the United States, got both his BA here and his PhD. And he's also a longtime friend of the United States. So without further ado, let me introduce my good friend, Tom Lembach. Please give him a warm welcome.
Thank you so much for that very kind introduction, Ambassador Blake. Ambassador Blake, Ambassador Merrill, ambassadors, deputy ambassadors. I'm sorry if I don't mention each and every one of you one by one. As you mentioned, it's quite a crowd, but thank you so much to all of you, to USINDO, to the sponsors, Chapman, Chevron, and others for making this event possible. Indeed, as you said, Ambassador Merrill, this is a wonderful opportunity in both directions. We're very keen to convey our vision, our mission for the country, our values, our strategy, our approaches, right? We're keen to hear from you, right? In the Q&A, what are your concerns? How do you see things? So it's just really such a delight and such an honor for me to be here representing the Anis Mohaimin campaign. So, sorry, I need to put on a stopwatch because I'm a very terrible timekeeper and I need to discipline myself from being too verbose. But I thought I would start first with a bit of a journey down memory lane. Right. What is the journey that Indonesia has been on for the last at least 5, 6, 7 years, right? Obviously, we're all aware that there's been a massive build-out of infrastructure under President Jokowi, right? There's also been a very meaningful amount of opening up of the economy to international investment. But sadly, all that has happened amidst a steady decline in our democratic values and our democratic practices. and the steady degradation of our institutions. It's also, in our view, come at the cost of our geopolitical balance, with Indonesian diplomacy a bit lost at sea, our diplomats primarily assigned to be mere salesmen for investment, and now to drum up interest in our new capital city project. Meanwhile, in our analysis, I can assure you that our economy is not as wonderful as our broad aggregate statistics would suggest. And I'll share some data to support my case shortly. I guess we should have known when in 2019, in the last month of his first term, President Jokowi signed into legislation the now infamous law that ended the status of our Corruption Eradication Commission, or KPK, as an independent institution. The KPK, once the most trusted and the most popular institution in our country, is now just another part of our civil service, reporting to the president and operating under a supervisory board appointed by the president. Since then, the KPK has become heavily politicized. The culmination of its demise came a few weeks ago when the chairman of the KPK himself was named a criminal suspect by our national police for engaging in a corrupt act of extorting money by abusing his power, and he was forced to resign. Each year after that infamous 2019 KPK law revision then brought another downgrade to the quality of our democracy and the professionalism of our institutions. In 2020, the Omnibus Jobs Creation Law was passed with minimal public consultation. We as investors, we celebrate its positive parts, like the abolition of our negative investment list, something that I personally fought for all my years in cabinet and happily celebrated when that passed as part of our Omnibus Job Creation Law. But this Omnibus Law came at a tremendous cost in terms of the credibility and the functioning of our institutions. For example, peppered dozens of times across this 1,000+ page law is the phrase, "with the approval of the central government." The Omnibus Law therefore represents the greatest re-centralization of powers back to the central government, reversing one of the biggest achievements of the post-Suharto dictatorship reform movement, which was the decentralization of powers to the regions, or what we call regional autonomy. Devolution of powers, in our view, is now largely in phrase only. Most local governments either struggle to get anything done while waiting for long periods of time for central government approval, or they just give up and tell investors and businesses to just go to Jakarta to go get their permits and approvals there. A year later, in 2021, came the new capital city law, again with virtually zero public consultation, seeking to build a new capital from scratch at a cost of $32 billion, when the same amount of money could be used to improve the poor basic infrastructure of dozens of cities around the country, strikes us in the Anies Mohaimin campaign as an absurdity. We also believe it is politically suicidal to talk about spending tens of billions of dollars on lavish accommodations for our state officials during a time when the price of rice and other basic needs has risen 20 to 30% in the last 12 months. Then another year went by, and in early 2022 came a well-orchestrated effort to weaken or even abolish presidential term limits, another prized achievement of the post-dictatorship reform period. A few months later, still in 2022, came the ratification of our new criminal code, which criminalizes a vast range of public behaviors, ranging from insulting symbols of state, to spreading misinformation, to culture war-type issues, which by public consensus should be treated as private. Why legislate such an absurd criminal code? Because it gives our law enforcement agencies a vast new arsenal of potential infractions from which to extort money from our public, from executives and business owners, or from politicians who dare to step out of line. Lastly, in 2023, came the now infamous circus at our Constitutional Court, where the Chief Justice, who a year earlier had married our president's sister, engineered a court decision abolishing the minimum age limit for running for president or vice president, thereby opening the way for his nephew, the president's 36-year-old son, to run for vice president on Minister Prabowo's ticket. And similar to the fate of the KPK chairman, who was indicted for corruption, that now infamous Chief Justice and presidential brother-in-law was found by the court's ethics panel to have seriously violated the Constitutional Court's Code of Ethics and was removed from his position. Yet, because of a quirk of our legal system, the Constitutional Court's decision is irrevocable and stands as legal and binding, despite having been promulgated in a clearly unethical way. So as we look back at the last 5 years, we can see a step-by-step erosion of our institutions. I would argue that our whole system is now teetering on the brink of becoming institutions in name only, and becoming instead de facto organizations of patronage and extortion. Well, some people might argue that it's all worth it, if that's what it takes to achieve high economic growth. After all, our government prides itself on the 5% per year GDP growth, which supposedly we've been consistently achieving outside of the pandemic, supposedly among the highest within the G20 economies. And it's here that I would like to offer an alternative view of our economy. Here's a graphic of our nationwide annual motorcycle sales. As you can see, they peaked at close to 8 million units per year around 2013 and have been continuously declining ever since. Of course, collapsing during the pandemic, then recovering, but still hovering at only around 5 million units per year last year, a decline of more than 35% over 10 years. Right. Here's a graphic of our annual nationwide car sales. Not as severe of a decline as our motorcycle sales, but more of a modest decline, peaking at around 1.23 million units per year in 2013, and then largely sort of experiencing a gentle decline, likewise collapsing during the pandemic, recovering. But today they're still about 12, 15% below the level we achieved 10 years ago, right? Here's a graphic of our consumer electronic sales or appliances, things like refrigerators, washing machines, televisions, right? It's about $11 billion per year in 2016. And it's been on a gentle downward sloping decline, reaching around $10 billion per year in 2021. Now, here's another one. Oops, sorry. This is our nationwide electricity consumption. And if we do the math, it shows a compound annual growth rate of 4%, right? A bit of a contrast to our supposed GDP growth of 5% per year. Now, why are these kinds of proxy statistics important? In Indonesia, as I presume would be the case in many developing countries, it's when a family becomes eligible for a motorcycle loan that they technically enter the middle class, right? Like a family that gets one motorcycle and potentially two is seen as having finally made it, as having arrived in the middle class. A family that then becomes eligible for a car loan in our society is seen as having reached the upper middle class, right? And if you have a home and over time might upgrade to a bigger home, right? You will be accumulating appliances, right? You might start with only a refrigerator and a television and maybe a ceiling fan. But as your income grows, as your family grows, as your career flourishes, you might buy a second television, maybe a bigger one. You might buy an air conditioner, right? You might buy a microwave. And so, again, these are all classic signs of the growth of the middle class. And what I would suggest to you is that what these statistics show is that for 10 years, our middle class has not been growing. And quite possibly, our middle class has, in fact, been shrinking, right? Why is it that our middle class is not growing for the last 10 years? It's because our economic growth, in our analysis, has been driven purely by the upper classes, the top 10 to 20% of our population, maybe even less. And why is this the case? Because the focus of our government's investment promotion has been mostly on capital-intensive sectors, which at best have only a meaningful impact on about 20 to 30% of our population, right? The underlying reality of this economic strategy is that our economy has been largely driven by commodities sectors such as coal mining, palm oil, right? Now, proudly, nickel, but also popular agricultural commodities such as coffee beans, right? Which I think if you've been to your favorite coffee shop recently, you might have noticed that your cup of joe is meaningfully pricier, right? But things like coconut, seafood, like those are commodities sectors which have done well in our country. But in our estimation, at best 10 to 20% of our population is engaged in those sectors, right? Now, there might be another 10% of the economy that receives what we call positive spillovers, such as tourism industry, lifestyle industries, right? As people get rich on palm oil or coal mining or agricultural commodities from the provinces, they might come to Jakarta more often, seek higher end medical care, put their kids into pricier private schools, do more frequent vacations to Bali, right? So that has to be another 10% of our society that sort of receives this positive spillover. But that still leaves 70 to 80% of our society outside the booming sectors of this commodities-driven industries. Meantime, labor-intensive industries such as footwear factories, garment industries, furniture factories have been badly neglected. One of my favorite things is to point out to conferences or speaking engagements that just one American sportswear brand employs more than 600,000 Indonesian factory workers through 11 manufacturing partners in Indonesia. Yet both the principal, the brand owner, as well as their contract manufacturers have complained to me that our government has absolutely zero interest in their important industry, consigning it to the bin of so-called sunset industries, right? Like, if you parse the rhetoric, you parse the public comments of our leaders, our ministers, they are completely focused on nickel mining, nickel smelting, lithium-ion battery industry, EV industry, right? And they have absolutely no interest in what they call sunset industries, such as furniture factories, appliance factories, like electronics, garments, and footwear. And yet that's where the jobs are, right? They have minimal interest in the services sector, which today accounts for about 52% of our GDP. But as most of us know, most countries that move to rich country status do so on the back of urbanization and service industries, right? Here in the US, service industries probably account for close to 90% of GDP, right? And service industries are famously labor intensive. Again, that's where the jobs are. That's where the income growth would come from. Now, where that leaves us is that there simply is no purchasing power in the broad swath of our economy, which are the upper middle class, the middle class, and the lower middle class, not to mention the lower income classes, which together comprise 60 to 70%, maybe even 80% of our society. Our economic strategy of the last 10 years has therefore failed our public. This is leading to weaker and weaker underlying growth momentum, and it's time for a fundamental change. Anies Baswedan and Muhaimin Iskandar are running for president and vice president of Indonesia to continue all the good reformist policies which are currently in place, while reversing the democratic backsliding, restoring professionalism and dignity to our institutions, rebalancing our diplomacy and geopolitics back to our values and principles, and rebalancing our economy away from our heavy commodity dependence and the unsustainable disparities currently undermining our economy. How would we seek to do that? For one, Governor Anis has already publicly stated that we will revise that infamous and unfortunate 2019 law on the KPK. Personally, I could even imagine abolishing that 2019 law altogether, thereby going back to the 2002 law, and thereby also restoring the KPK to its previous status as an independent institution, accountable only to the public. We would restore professionalism and dignity to our institutions by returning to the practice of appointing high officials on the basis of competence and merit, including technocratic ministers, to key positions within the cabinet and beyond. And broadly speaking, Anis and Mohaimin would make a strong push to move what we currently consider our policy orientation away from the famously transactional approach of our current government, focused only on narrow business interests like the nickel mining and smelting sectors, to a much more values-based policy, or maybe among think tanks or practitioners, we call it principles-based policy, that upholds the values and norms that our people hold dear. What are those values? Well, among others, a strong sense of fairness. I personally prefer that term to the overused term of justice. The primacy of human life, also known as humanism or humanitarianism, and our stewardship over nature, the notion that God created nature, and that we have a moral obligation to protect and live in harmony with all of God's creatures. Governor Anis has a strong track record over 5 years governing in Jakarta. During that time, he doubled public transport coverage in Jakarta within 5 years, from previously reaching only 40% of the city to reaching around 90% of the city today, mostly by aggressively expanding our famous busway system of dedicated lane buses, also known as bus rapid transit, and by integrating it with other modes of transport such as our shiny new subway system. As a result, household spending on transportation and mobility, which previously consumed a shocking 30% of the average household budget in Jakarta, today only consumes about 18% of the average household budget in Jakarta. Like it's a meaningful boost to the middle class families' purchasing power in Jakarta, right? Mohaimin Iskandar's PKB party has held the labor ministry and the villages ministry for a couple of decades. Personally, I fondly recall PKB ministers, labor minister Hanif Dakiri and villages minister Eko Sanjoyo, as among the most professional ministers in the cabinet. And I proudly consider them to have belonged to the reformist, progressive, and internationalist faction of the cabinet that I also consider myself to belong to. And beyond the admirable career track records of Governor Anis and Party Chairman Mohaimin, we believe that their ostensible sincerity and good-heartedness is resonating with the voters. What are the implications for the US and for the world? First, we strongly, sincerely believe that not only are we a democracy, we believe that our people, our society, want us to remain a democracy. We may be temporarily charmed by dictatorial types such as General Prabowo, but whether in time for this election or in the years to come, we will realize how crucial it is to elect leaders who are genuinely, sincerely committed to shoring up and strengthening our democratic values and practices, such as freedom of expression and social justice. As the saying goes, we don't really appreciate something until it's gone. That infamous criminal code goes into effect another 2 years from now, depending on the outcome of this year's election. It is then that we will feel the full consequences of the downward slide we've been on for the last few years. We respect other countries that have adopted different forms of governance, including single-party rule and even authoritarian government. But we believe that we must all be committed, first, to the will of each of our peoples, and second, to causes of common interest that threaten all of us equally, such as the climate crisis, antibiotic resistance, and antimicrobial resistance, which today kills more people around the world every year than either malaria or HIV, microplastics, chemical pollution, and the rising burden of chronic diseases or so-called lifestyle diseases such as diabetes, high blood pressure, heart disease, and cancer. Our values-based policy will mean that we'll agree with you 70% of the time, but disagree with you about 30% of the time. Likewise, we expect we will agree with China about 70% of the time. We will probably disagree with China 30% of the time. But at least each of you will know why we agree and why we disagree. And I hope you will each be able to respect our stance, because our stance will be naturally and logically rooted in our clearly stated values and principles. Please wish us and our beloved country all the best during this crucial election year. And I thank you once again for this wonderful opportunity to represent the Anies Mohaimin campaign in this iconic USINDO election series. Thank you very much.
Tom, thank you very much. I have the chair closest to the microphone, so I'll take that prerogative to ask you the first question. So you gave a very compelling argument for Governor Anies and some of the concerns you see with what's happening to democracy, what's happening to the economy, what's happening to the environment, etc. So this is a bit of a tough question, but why, if you have such a compelling campaign message, are you guys in third place so far? And is the governor getting his message across, or what is happening there? And then secondly, you've talked a number of times about environment. You know, the climate change is going to whack us all it's coming, the train is coming. And I'm just wondering if Governor Anies has some particular ideas of how he'd like to mitigate the damage that might happen to Indonesia. Thank you very much, and good luck to you.
Thank you, Murray. Well, first, happy to report that many, and certainly a rising number of polls and surveys now put us in second place. And supposedly we've overtaken Governor Ganjar, right? I can lift the curtain a little bit now on our campaign strategy. As I've shared with some of you privately, actually staying in third place was always a deliberate decision, right? So first, many of us are veterans of the Jokowi campaigns, and we learned from President Jokowi's experience in 2013, where he suffered a phenomenon that we like to call peaking too soon. And that's exactly what happened to Governor Ganjar. Right. So basically, the Ganjar acolytes kind of pumped up his popularity to stratospheric heights about 2 years ago. And we knew that that's extremely difficult to maintain for long periods of time. Right. At some point, people just get bored. And that's exactly what's happened. Right. Like as other candidates enter the fray and expend resources, like his ratings and electability have gone steadily down. Right. And then, of course, came the devastating decision or development of the president's son, becoming Minister Prabowo's VP running mate, and then a whole bunch of ruling party voters moved with the president to the Prabowo Gibran ticket, right? But we always knew that it's dangerous to be the leading candidate too soon, right? For various reasons, including the fact that it's just very difficult to keep that up. For long periods of time. Ours is definitely an underdog strategy, right? I like to describe it as the turtle and the hare, right? We may have started from last place. We might be going slowly, but we believe we're going steadily, we're going systematically, and we're avoiding blunders, right? On climate change, it's an issue that Governor Anies and I are extremely passionate about. We might even say slightly panicked about, because as I shared with some around our table, Jakarta hit a record 40 degrees Celsius this past summer, right? It was a talk of town. Around the same time, I think Bangkok and and Hanoi hit 45 Celsius, right? So the climate crisis is very much upon us. I know that Governor Anis is a big believer in underwriting risks for development of renewable energy that are excessive for the private sector, right? For example, in geothermal exploration, we understand that you have a success ratio of maybe 1 in 50 or 1 in 100 in terms of like the number of wells you have to drill before you finally hit, economically feasible geothermal resources, right? That's arguably too much risk to bear for private sector developers, right? So we're keen to develop transparent mechanisms, right, to essentially underwrite some of the exploration risk and development risk for renewable energies such as that. So happy to talk more about sort of energy transition ideas or energy efficiency ideas, but that sort of gives you maybe a picture for how we see things.
Hi, I'm Galen Carey with the National Association of Evangelicals. Thank you so much for your presentation. In some parts of Indonesia, I know that religious minorities enjoy a great deal of freedom and opportunity, and others not so much. And I wonder, what is your coalition's position and plans with regard to protection and freedom of religious minorities in Indonesia?
Thank you. Again, an extremely important question. Our diversity, including ethnic diversity, religious diversity, is an important feature of our society, and we believe a major strength of our society, right? Happy to report that under Governor Anis, he built more churches in Jakarta in 5 years than the previous 4 governors combined. Right? It's during Governor Anis's time that in our main boulevards, Sudirman, Tamrin, or Sunan Said, you had Christmas trees and Christmas carols. He was the first governor to build crematoria for the Hindu community, right? And for the first time in a long time, as any of us Jakartans can remember, 5 years went by without any single raid on bars, restaurants, places of nighttime entertainment by right-wing or radical vigilantes, right? I am ethnic Chinese and Catholic myself. I've known Governor Anis, been close friends with him for 18 plus years, right? And today, I like to often argue to my fellow minorities that actually the only figure who can protect minorities like us is somebody like Anis, right? Who has strong credibility with the Muslim majority. Like, his faith is not questioned. He doesn't have to prove himself, right? In fact, he has that credibility, and he has those channels across the spectrum of Muslim voters that enables him to reach out and to gently discuss and where necessary even argue, right? Again, we could come back to this. There's actually some extremely touching stories of how he persuaded very conservative Muslim neighborhoods to finally give way and allow for building permits for churches to be built. We haven't been publicizing it because we don't want to seem like we're exploiting those people that we persuaded, right? Like, we want these news to come out organically from those communities, right? Because the history is that once those churches are built, usually they become quite popular in their neighborhoods. Our Protestant and Catholic communities are actually extremely good at outreach to the neighboring mosque, at outreach to the surrounding Muslim community, and vice versa. Those outreach are generally heartily reciprocated by the mosques, right? Like, they come over for Christmas, But we want that to happen organically. We want them to enthuse about how vibrant the communities become, right? We don't want, to claim credit and be sort of politically cynical and turn those achievements into political commodities. Like our faith is too important to make that a plaything of politicians. Thank you, Ambassador.
Tom, thank you very much for your usual, very straightforward, informed, and very well organized presentation today. I would have expected no less from you, but you've risen beyond that. I think the question that most Americans are going to ask the day after the election or the day after the elections is, were the elections free and fair? And so I'm going to put you on the spot because I know the campaign is not finished yet and has a good ways to go. But how would you characterize the campaigns and the elections so far? Could you describe it as free and fair and representative of the will of Indonesia's voters? Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Well, it's hardly a secret that the campaign of Minister Prabowo and Gibran Rakabuming are utilizing as much as they can all the state institutions to benefit their campaign. I mean, that's sort of not even a scandalous thing to say in Jakarta or Indonesia anymore. It's sort of taken as a given. Again, to me, it's a sad reflection of how far we've sort of slid. That sort of behavior has become almost normalized, right? So we are fighting on an uneven playing field, right? We're not playing on a level playing field. But what's interesting is that Governor Anies is the only candidate who has experience with a two-round election or a runoff race, right? That's what happened to him in the Jakarta governor election in 2017, right? Where he came in second in the first round. So the incumbent, Governor Ahok, got 43% of the vote. Governor Anies got 40%. And President Yudhoyono's son, Agus, got 17%. In the second round, Agus endorsed Anies, and all 17% went to Anies, enabling him, therefore, to defeat the incumbent 57-43, right? So we think the way the mathematics plays out is that it's highly likely that the race will go to a runoff. Like, all three candidates have very strong supporters, like very committed supporters. All the campaigns have considerable strength, so it's mathematically quite unlikely that any candidate, including ourselves, will be able to garner 50.1% in a single round. But where it becomes very interesting is who's going to be the loser of the first round, and who will that loser endorse in the second round, right? Now, happy to go into the personalities and the personal conflicts between the key players, but I think, many of you are already familiar with those, so may not need to be covered, on stage. But for sure, either the Ganjar campaign nor the Anies campaign is likely to endorse the Prabowo ticket in the second round, right? Now, I think one thing we worry about now is kind of non-linear shocks, either internal or external, right? Certainly, we never underestimate our rivals. They'll stop at nothing. And for example, some kind of an unexpected shock 2 weeks before voting day, right? That's a game changer in some way. That, for example, then lays the groundwork for the Prabowo Gibran campaign to claim 50.1% in the first round, right? Again, happy to go into more detail or take that discussion offline. But look, ultimately, all we can do is to campaign our strength, right? Actually, one positive news, Ambassador and colleagues, we're starting to be encouraged, even a bit moved by the possibility that we're actually in the process of redefining what it means to be campaigning, right? So especially those of you who've been through multiple elections in Indonesia know that in the past, campaigns have been mostly like concerts, like rallies, like a lot of music, a lot of dancing, a lot of free food, kind of like rah rah, merdeka merdeka kind of speeches, right? But not a lot of substance. Governor Ani's campaign and vice presidential candidate Mohaimin and campaign chairs and vice chairs like myself followed suit. But we're arguably the first campaign in our country's history to campaign on the basis of town halls. So we're actually going city by city, right? Neighborhood by neighborhood. We're having town halls of 100, 300, 500, 1,000, 3,000 people. And the town halls are called Press Anis, like Desak Anis. Slepet Imin, slepet is to whip somebody with a towel, but in our madrasas, we wear these cloth, and so the boarding school, the boarding house, students like to whip each other with this cloth, right? So it's like whip Mohaimin, and then because we use a soccer analogy, our national campaign is has captain and co-captains and coaches and head coaches. So I'm co-captain number 2, and we have our own town hall event called the national team's locker room, right? Where again, it's like ask Tom, ask me anything, right? And sometimes it's like rapid fire questions. The most, one of the more recent town halls that went viral on the media, Anis was asked what were his views on LGBTQ. And he answered. And he was asked his views on marijuana. And he answered. This is putting significant pressure on the other 2 campaigns to up their game, right? Like, it's becoming an embarrassment that the other 2 campaigns are mostly still dancing, right? And offering concerts and free food and not talking about issues. Right? And we're out there talking about policies, like concrete ideas, concrete programs that will support the middle class, right? Concrete programs like government subsidized daycare, an economic strategy that would focus or shift our focus from capital-intensive industries to labor-intensive industries, right? An economic strategy about fostering services sectors, such as finance and banking, hospitality, lifestyle, healthcare, and education. So we're the only campaign that's out there. And the data indicates that the voters are responding enthusiastically. Actually, our colleague from BP earlier was surprised when I mentioned that we have a record share of first-time voters in this election. Fully 1/3 of all the voters this year will be first-time voters. 55% of our voters will be millennial and Gen Z, right? And again, I apologize for the rather somber tone of my remarks. Let me make up for it with a lighter tone or a more hopeful tone in my Q&A. But I actually call this young generation, millennials and Gen Z, the most well-informed, like the most well-educated, and the most idealistic generation in history. Like we call them digital natives. Like they've grown up on YouTube, on Instagram, on Netflix, right? Since an early age. And they've been imbibing, they've been consuming, frankly, mostly English language content, right? Increasingly now we have a thriving local content industry, like content creators, like influencers and podcasts and so on. But I think they're the most well-informed, they're the most policy engaged, and the most like climate concerned, like Palestine concerned, like human rights concerned, like, social justice concerned generation I've ever seen. And again, I think we're merely responding to what we see as market. Like we're merely reflecting what we believe is the feedback from the field in terms of what our voters want to see. I think our voters want to see ideas. They want to see concrete examples of policies that will benefit them, that will solve bread and butter issues that they face day to day and week to week. So we think that's a positive progress for our democracy, that we're moving in that direction in terms of like campaigning and running for office. Much more oriented towards substance, ideas, policy.
Thank you, Pat Tom. My name is Susie Hayworth. I'm with UC Davis Association in Indonesia in Washington, D.C. I'm so glad that you touched on it at the end of your tale of your thing about education. So I would like to ask if Pak Anies' policy in terms of education, growing up in Indonesia, access to education was it was good, but I think it could be better. What is Pak Anies' view on access education? I'm particularly interested on the women and education across island, especially on the remote islands, as well as economically disadvantaged. I think that's really is important for, in a way, being a stronger Indonesia that way. That's my first question. My second question is, I know Pak Anies was really big in education and also like to do collaborations. When our kids really here in Washington, D.C. in the school, then Pak Anies was the Minister of Education, do a lot of collaboration with the DCPS, and later on also with state university like UC Davis. Do you think if Pak Anies elected, will be continuing the collaborations on the universities, student exchange, particularly also research as well? So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Hayworth. So actually, one of my biggest disappointments of the last 10 years is that we had previously discussed with President Jokowi an overarching policy strategy where we would focus on what we call hardware in the first term, then shift to what we call software in the second term, right? And hardware would include highways, airports, seaports, power plants, factories, all the things that the president is famous for, right? Where software would include things like healthcare, education, and institutions, right? But sadly, that didn't happen. Instead, in fact, we doubled down on hardware in the second term, and we continue to neglect the software, including healthcare and education, but especially institutions, as I mentioned in my remarks, right? Now, in our view, that makes it all the more imperative that we execute that pivot straight away, right, upon taking office. Like we believe that actually the biggest challenges we face now are in health and education, right? Those are now, in our view, major drags on the economy. Like those are the things that are actually causing a lot of people who have reached middle class to fall back into lower income class, right? So they're only a single medical disaster away from, family bankruptcy, for example. Now, the other thing that actually comes to mind, Ms. Hayworth, is we actually want to shift the economic strategy way, way back towards private sector. Like, so basically, in our view, over the last 5-7 years, our government's become more and more enamored with having our state-owned enterprises, right? And having everything be done by the state and the government. And actually, in many respects, the private sector has been sort of pushed aside, right? Now, why do I mention this now, right? Because in my view, actually, the shortages and quality problems we have in healthcare and education are among the biggest business opportunities in our country today. I was actually startled to see the financial accounts or financial report of Siloam Hospitals, a publicly listed hospital company. They are massively profitable now, right? So one thing about healthcare education that we're keen on is to actually provide the policy framework, right? Provide the incentives and stability to enable private sector to fill those needs, right? Actually, embarrassingly, I only realized recently, we're home to two of the largest, in fact, the two largest Muslim community organizations in the world, right? Muhammadiyah and Nahdlatul Ulama, or NU. And Muhammadiyah actually runs a network of very successful schools and universities. And many of them are quite renowned. Like the Al-Azhar schools are among the most prestigious. And actually just belatedly realized that those are categorized as private sector schools. They use 0 rupiah from state budget. They're fully funded by tuition fees paid by parents. They're funded by research revenues or other revenues normally associated with private sector schools and universities. So I think Governor Anies previously waived property taxes for educational institutions in a bid to lower the cost of education for the public. I think I myself, when I relaunched and successfully negotiated and completed our free trade agreement with Australia, right, made opening up our university sector actually a top priority, and it was successful. It was basically signed in the FTA, free trade agreement. Our university sector went from 0% foreign ownership to allowed to 100% foreign ownership allowed overnight, and that opening up was actually encoded in the Omnibus Law, right? And since then, Monash University from Melbourne has opened a campus in the suburbs of Jakarta. Other universities from Australia like Deakin and Curtin have opened our opening soon. So number one is private sector. Number two is international engagement, right? I think disparities in access to education are a major driver of regional disparities, right? And are a major drag on social mobility. We're fortunate to have a number of women in our campaign team. And I can assure you both Governor Anies's wife and Mr. Mohammed's wife are very engaged on women's and children's issues. And in fact, we see the reality that, especially for our middle class, and lower middle class, and working class families, the women are really the backbone of the family, right? At a town hall event in Surabaya a few days ago, we picked as our theme the so-called sandwich generation, right? So people who are sandwiched between taking care of their parents, the previous generation, and having to take care of their younger siblings or children. And overwhelmingly, the burden falls on the women in the family. It's actually astonishing. So at that event, I got all the ladies, especially all excited when I asked my fellow team vice chair, a lady who was a lawmaker from East Java, why do we have daycare? Like, why we have no daycare? Why we have no system of government subsidized daycare, right? And that sort of became a big meme on Instagram and then TikTok. Wow, finally, one of the campaigns is addressing this pain point for working mothers everywhere, right? So hopefully that gives you a flavor for how we see education, access to education, and the role of women in families and the economy, frankly. Actually, it took me the better part of 2 years to fully understand Governor Anis's philosophy. For 2 years and beyond, actually, he's been saying, right? But I've been contemplating his argument that as a leader, especially of a nation or a city, you have to be a leader for all. Like, you shouldn't demonize or exclude any group, no matter how uncomfortable their ideology or their position, right? Only recently I realized, for example, I think I'd rather have people say things out loud rather than on the dark web or underground. I'd rather have people be out and about, whether they're right-wing, left-wing, ultra-capitalist, ultra-anti-capitalist, whatever it is. I'd rather have it all out in the open. I'd rather have it all in the public discourse. When you demonize and basically refuse to engage in dialogue with certain groups, you'll end up driving them underground, where they will fester and metastasize the way, radical terrorism did for many decades, right? By bringing even extreme views out into the public, right? I believe those extreme views will attract solutions, right? So Governor Anis is a huge believer in the power of and importance of dialogue with all parties. Actually, Ms. Hayworth, you correctly referenced his strong propensity towards collaboration. It's actually a key theme of his, to the point where he chose as Jakarta's slogan, Jakarta, City of Collaboration, right? Now, one of my favorite stories actually is like this. I think it was a TED talk, like TED podcast, by a female environmental activist. And she was recounting the story of how she was going into a meeting with a much reviled executive of an oil and gas company. My apologies to sponsors here for that industry. And, that executive was a man. And they both came to the boardroom for the meeting. And the man opened up his laptop. And the screensaver on his laptop was his children, one or more of whom were handicapped, differently able. And this female environmental activist suddenly said, "Oh, you have disabled children or differently able children, right?" And it struck a chord because she too had differently able children. So suddenly these two sworn enemies found something they had in common and started bonding over what it was like to be parenting special needs children. So when you bring people together, even of extreme opposing views, and facilitate a kind of dialogue, it's almost guaranteed that that will improve mutual understanding, right? And eventually moderate extreme views. And I've seen it time and again. Even I personally acknowledge that I get provoked. Some of the hardline people will make provocative statements and it raises my blood pressure, right? It's only recently I've learned to take it in stride, right? To see people of extreme views as fellow human beings and to try to visualize myself in a meeting with them. What we talk about, right? I think let's start by talking about our families. Let's start talking about our mothers. Right? Let's start talking about our siblings. Let's start talking about our upbringing. What were our childhoods like, right? So I believe that's the only real way to bridge differences and to bring people together, right? Our current government's approach of continually, screaming that we minorities have rights under the Constitution, I don't think is the right approach to solving these disparities, right? We've cultivated this culture where we keep screaming about our rights, but rarely talk about our responsibilities. I mean, the numerical fact is that we ethnic Chinese disproportionately dominate the upper classes and the business elites, right? So why do we talk about paying more taxes? Why don't we talk about doing more, right, to foster the middle class? Why don't we talk about, what we should be doing more? Like, why are we only talking about our rights under the Constitution as minorities to be protected? Why do we live in exclusive compounds protected, by sometimes 7-meter tall walls, right? Why aren't we out there, and we go into our chauffeured cars, exit our compounds or apartment towers, go to the office, go into our office. After that, go back into our chauffeured cars, go into pricey high-end malls, right? From the malls, go back to our apartments or compounds. And that's, for example, why Governor Anis was such a big believer in public transport, what they call third spaces, right? Because those third spaces is where people mingle, right? Of all beliefs, of all races, of all religions, right? Of all income levels. Like if I take the subway, there's no first class, business class, economy class, right? We're all sitting in the same queue. Like we're all, sitting on the same seats, taking the same trains. He renovated or built 40 parks around the city where families from all income levels, families of all religions, families of all persuasions come and play in the evenings, after sunset or on weekends. That's an example of where you have to fix market failure, right? Because naturally, if you leave with the private sector, they will do what's called market segmentation, right? They'll have a high-end mall, they'll have a medium-end mall, they'll have a low-end mall. And those income levels will never meet because they are sorted into different market segments, right? So again, I hope this is a good insight, right? At a minimum, I want to plant seeds in your mind of a different approach to these long simmering issues. Thank you.
Tom, thanks so much for your frank, candid, thoughtful, and insightful remarks. You've given us new insights on your campaign and your program of your candidates. Tomorrow's program, the third program, is with the Pro Bono Coalition. That program will be held at the USINDO offices as a breakfast at 8:20 to 8:30 a.m. start, finishing at about 10:20 a.m. Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes today's program. Let's again give our speaker, our USINDO, thank you.